Alfred North Whitehead once famously said, "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato." In this video, I want to briefly consider Plato's argument for the immutability of God, which he presents in Book 2 of the Republic. I then want to offer some thoughts on how a Christian theologian might push back against Plato's argument, but first it's important to look carefully at Plato's reasoning. So what is divine immutability? This is the doctrine that God cannot change either from external or internal means. So God cannot change God's self, nor can God be changed by humanity or creation. Plato's argument for this doctrine is the classical one. Plato begins with an analogy. Consider how good clothing is changed over time. Its condition goes from being good to bad due to its use and other effects acting upon it. Then Socrates suggests, in contrast to clothing, the God and what belongs to the God are in every way in the best condition. He then suggests that God has the least of all varieties or shapes, which is simply a way of saying that God is one. The key point in the argument then comes next. Socrates asks, if God changes God's self or is changed, then to what does he transform himself into? Something better or worse? His dialogue partner responds, necessarily into what's worse, if he altered at all, for surely we won't say that the God is wanting in beauty or virtue. Socrates asks, does God or anyone willingly make themselves worse? And of course not. The conclusion then is this. Then it's impossible for a God to want to alter himself. But since, as it seems, each of them is as fair and as good as possible, he remains forever simply in his own shape. So that then is the basic argument for divine immutability. Finite things change because they are finite and subject to being deteriorated. But an infinite God, who is in every way the best possible condition, cannot be changed or choose to change, because choosing to change would mean becoming worse than the best. It would mean transforming into a worse version of God's self. So the claim that God can be changed or might change God's self is refuted by this simple but profoundly influential argument. From this simple explanation, so much of Western theology has been built. The assumption for most is that God is immutable, that is, unable to change or be changed by another, even by God. Now, from the Christian perspective, there are two critiques that can be brought against the notion of divine immutability. First, for a Christian theologian who considers the Bible normative, the biblical witness to God's changeability is at least a point of contention with this doctrine. Many theologians within the category of classical theism will argue that the biblical witness needs to be conformed to this logical argument, while others will suggest that the Bible is describing God's essential nature when it bears witness to God changing. For example, when God is said to change God's mind in the Hebrew Bible, or more simply when it is applied that God is affected by human praise or action. And so we have on one hand this choice between a philosophical concept of God, argued quite well by Plato, and the reality of the biblical scriptures, which hold up to this concept that God does change, that God repents even, that God is affected by human prayers and actions. And so the biblical witness causes the first problem with this argument. Portrays a God who's not unchanging in this abstract sense, but a God who can and does sometimes change. The Bible, of course, also upholds the faithfulness of God, but that is not necessarily the same thing as arguing that God cannot change. A second critique we might bring against this in a similar vein could be presented through the theology of somebody like Karl Barth, who would protest that immutability is an abstraction, and Christian theology must deal with the concrete revelation of God in Jesus Christ. Thus, the question we ask cannot be, how do we understand God in the light of this abstract argument from Plato about immutability, but rather, how do we understand God in the light of God's self-revelation in the life of Jesus Christ as witnessed in Scripture? And so Barth is emphatic that we argue from the actuality of God's self-revelation, the actual event of Jesus Christ, and only then do we arrive at what is or is not possible for God. Not, in other words, moving from what we consider to be possible for God and then trying to contextualize the actuality of what happens in the life of Jesus according to what we've defined as possible. And so Barth emphasizes we move from actuality to possibility and not the reverse in our theological thinking. To put this more simply, Barth argues that we cannot begin with an abstract concept of God apart from Jesus Christ, but rather we have to look exclusively and solely where God has revealed God's self, which is in the life and person of Jesus Christ. And from his life do we then derive any sense of whether or not God can or cannot change. And so these critiques are just two options of the ways that we might push back against Plato's argument from the Christian perspective. But it's still worth noting that Plato's argument is extremely influential still within the Christian church and within Christian theologies, particularly Western theologies, such as those that you can find based on the Westminster Catechism. The Westminster Catechism begins with a somewhat abstract definition of God before later moving into a more concrete definition of God. Theologians like T.F. Torrance have critiqued the Westminster Catechism for that very reason and argue that it actually has two doctrines of God that are irreconcilable. It has a philosophical God that's abstractly defined, and then it has the Christian God, which is the triune God, which appears later in that catechism. And so that tension between the abstract philosophical God and the God revealed in Scripture, the God of God's own self-revelation, is something that's a clear contrast here. But it's a big debate, and it's an interesting one to be aware of, especially thinking through some of the different more modern concepts that this has been led to. For example, the critiques of impassibility, the idea that God cannot suffer. Theologians like Jürgen Moltmann have taken Barth's move to focus on actuality instead of possibility to argue that God does suffer, that suffering is actually within the bosom of the Trinity, that God suffers with us, and that God is not unable to suffer, that God does not have no passion. Impassibility just means without passion. Mark Moltmann has been able to push back against that more classical philosophical concept of God with a more Christocentric concept of who God is. And I've mentioned this many times in this channel that for Barth and for a lot of the theologians that are inspired by Barth, there is no God behind the back of Jesus Christ. And so this would be an example of positing such a God, through an abstract speculative concept of immutability. But regardless, Plato's still a significant figure, and it's worth being aware of his thought, particularly because it's influence, but also because Plato was just a really fascinating thinker. I went back last week actually, and I read Plato's Republic just because it's been a little while and I was doing some other stuff and I had some time, and it was fascinating really just to go through Plato's masterclass of how to construct an argument, how to dissect and to think really well. And I think a lot of times today, especially when people want to just race to the conclusion right away, the ability to sit with an argument is something that we lack a little bit in our kind of phone-centric and AI-centric society. And so reading somebody like Plato, I think, is a helpful thing for developing our own faculties, for arguing and for thinking through arguments all the way to the end. And so Plato's a great read for that if you're ever interested. I'll link below the version of the Republic that I read that I really enjoyed. But yeah, thanks so much for watching. Let me know if you have any comments or questions about this down below. And let me know if you want to hear more philosophy stuff like this. I think philosophy is something I'm interested in, but I don't always do a ton of stuff on because I'm not really an expert in it. But let me know if these are the type of videos you like. But yeah, thanks for watching and have a great day.